Well, welcome everyone to the Humanists of Greater Portland. We're here this wonderful Sunday morning. Got a great presentation. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only to acknowledge all that humans have accomplished in the arts and science and humanities, but also simply for the possibility for peace and well-being when people interact with respect for one another. Today's reading will be by Al Christians, and he hadn't told me anything, he wouldn't tell me much about it, but it's an interesting speaker that he's going to do a reading about. And welcome, Al. Come on in.
Okay. My best friend called me crying because even though she spent months assiduously caring for her partner's dying mother, she worried that she hadn't made her last days quite as happy as possible. My emotions got in the way, she self-flagellated. Philosophers with a utilitarian bent tell us it's not good enough to do good. We have to do the most good possible. We have to mathematically quantify moral goodness so that we can then maximize it. The story starts all the way back in the 16th century when Europeans came up with a super sexy and revolutionary intellectual project that was double-entry bookkeeping. Figures like Bacon and Johann Kepler looked at the innovation in bookkeeping and thought, this way of parceling the world into chunks of data that are quantifiable and verifiable is great. We should imitate it for this new thing we're building called the scientific method. From the beginning, people saw optimization as a godly power. Francis Hutcheson, the Irish philosopher, coined the classic slogan, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. In the 1900s came computer technology. Nowadays, lots of people seem to think you can optimize morality. Effective altruists suggest you do better, be better, use data, and probabilistic thinking. For example, if you're building a self-driving car, you give it instructions about how to handle moral trade-offs. Swerve to avoid hitting a child, even if that means crashing into an elderly pedestrian? Question mark, question mark, question mark. In 2021, researchers at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence released an artificial intelligence model, Delphi, in response to, should I commit genocide if it makes everybody happy? Delphi said yes. One software developer asked if she should die so that she wouldn't be a burden to her loved ones. Yes, the artificial intelligence oracle replied, she should. Turns out teaching morality to machines is not so easy. The field of moral cognition is so in its infancy. You get all this power from data, but there's this massive price to pay at the entry point. You have to strip context and nuance and anything that requires sensitive judgment out of the input procedure. We have this out-of-control viral love of objectivity, which makes perfect sense for certain tasks, but not for others. Optimizing makes being human feel less risky. It provides a sense of control. How could I screw that up badly? That can all too easily lead to you to act in an ends justify the means way, like defrauding customers if you believe it's likely to produce a lot of money that you can then donate to needy people. After the Sam Bankman-Fried scandal, effective altruism was at pains to make clear that people shouldn't maximize utility if it means violating moral norms by defrauding people. While we often see emotions as clouding or biasing rational judgment, feelings are inseparable from morality. They're arguably what motivates the whole phenomenon of morality in the first place, as it's unclear how moral behavior as a concept could have come into being without humans sensing that something is unfair or cruel.
Our topic today, evolution of religion, incorporates the humanist commitments of critical thinking, empathy, and humility. Our speaker, Dr. Sarah Strand, is an associate lecturer in the Psychology Department of California State University, Sacramento. She earned her Ph.D. in Behavioral Neuroscience from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Strand created her course, Psychology of Religion, after speaking for 10 years to community groups around Northern California and Nevada. Dr. Strand, welcome. So glad you're here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Sharing with you one of my absolute most favorite topics that, as the introductor said, I started talking about back in 2010, so it's been almost 15 years now. And this sort of collection of talks that I'm going to be giving to you over the next several months helped me create my Psychology of Religion class at Sacramento State. So I'm going to just start right off because I know we don't have tons of time and let you know that today we're going to be focusing on more the evolution of religion. And because I am a behavioral neuroscientist, because I am a psychologist, I'm going to be talking about the evolution from different psychological perspectives. So we're not really going to talk about philosophy. We're not really going to talk about history or anthropology, which are absolutely interesting areas to discuss evolution of religion from those perspectives. But what I want to focus on is more the psychological aspect. And so to start us off, I do want to talk about this idea of culture evolving. We are all familiar with how genes might evolve to convey certain physical characteristics across generations, but we may be less familiar about how that might work with behaviors and ideas that make up culture. And then I'm going to launch into the second part of the talk, which is going to talk about the origin of religion from three separate psychological viewpoints. And then I'll wrap up the presentation about discussing just a small bit about how different religions have evolved over time, as well as how a religion has evolved in the United States. And then I'm happy to take some questions at the end. Okay, so to start us off, let me just talk a little bit about how evolution of physical characteristics work. In order for a particular trait to be more successful than others in a given environment, there absolutely has to be variability of those traits. That is one key characteristic that we absolutely must have. In order for a trait to be selected, there has to be different options to choose from. So what I'm picturing here on the screen is essentially two different colors of beetles. We have a green beetle and we have a brown beetle. So there's variability in sort of color of these different beetles. The second thing that evolution absolutely needs in order to happen is that variability that we see has to be able to be passed on to the next generation through, in this case, if we're talking about physical characteristics, through passing on your genes from one generation to the next. And so what I have pictured here, in this diagram, we have 5 brown beetles and just one green beetle. And you can see that when we talk about genetic heritability, the brown beetle can have two different types of genotypes. It can either be heterozygous with a big B and a small b, or it can be homozygous with two big B's. Either way, that's going to come across, we see, as a brown color. But the green beetle is the recessive characteristic. So there are two little b's that have to happen in order for us to observe that particular green color. So we've got variability in the population. We've got heritability in the population, but there's just one more thing that evolution needs in order for that particular characteristic to evolve, and that is that specific characteristic has to confer some type of differential reproduction. It has to be able to enhance the viability, essentially, or the frequency with which that particular characteristic exists in the population. So you see that these brown and green beetles are hanging out on a brown tree. and that the brown beetles blend into that tree a little bit better than the green beetle does. And so you have the bird here seeing very clearly those green beetles against that brown background and picking them off and eating them for food. And so that means that not only is that brown color variable in the population, or those colors are variable, not only are those colors heritable, they can be passed from one generation to the next, but if there is a beetle that has that brown color, it will confer an enhanced sort of reproductive frequency in the population so that that color continues to increase in frequency and survive. Okay, so when we're talking about evolution and we're talking about physical traits evolving, we absolutely need these three characteristics: variability, heritability, and differential reproduction. So what does this have to do with religion? What does this have to do with behaviors? Well, let's ask these questions. If we think about traits that evolve over time, specifically behaviors that evolve over time that might make up culture, do we have an idea that culture is different? Is culture variable around the world? Hopefully you're like nodding to yourself. I can't see everybody, but hopefully you're like, yeah, there are different cultures. Absolutely. Okay. Is culture heritable? In other words, can a culture be passed on through generations? Can parents pass on their culture to their offspring? Or can adults in an environment pass on culture to other individuals in that environment? Hopefully, yes, you're saying, okay, yes, there's absolutely a bit of culture that is what we might call heritable. And then the last question, can culture offer differential reproduction? In other words, can culture improve the frequency of that particular behavior or that particular trait in the environment? And so before we just answer that question, I want to show you this beautiful clip from a David Attenborough video that's quite old now. It's from his Life on Earth series called Life in the Trees, and it was hosted by BBC. Now, when we tested this video just before we started the meeting, it sounds like the volume is going to be pretty quiet on your end, but the video is captioned, and I'm actually going to make the video a little bit bigger. Hopefully I can make it, no, that's about as big as I can make it in order for you to see the captions. So it is captioned. I've made it about as big as I think I can make it, and it's about a 3-minute video. So.
Macaques live in many parts of Japan, and one population of them has become famous all over the world for their inventiveness. These live on a tiny offshore island called Koshima. They're an isolated troop, and they've made some remarkable changes in their behavior. For a long time, people used to think that the way in which creatures like these speak is largely instinctive. But then in 1952, scientists came to this island, and in order to entice the monkeys out into the open so they can observe them more closely, they started offering them sweet potatoes, like that. After about a year, a young female called Emo began to take her roots down to a pool and wash off the sand and mud before eating them. Within a few weeks, her close friends and her family, including her mother, were copying her. The habit spread, and 10 years later, almost all the monkeys on the island habitually washed their sweet potatoes. Then a new variation arose. Instead of using fresh water, the monkeys took the roots down to the sea and washed them there, even when they were clean already. Perhaps they simply liked salt on their potatoes. Only the very old didn't adopt the new customs. The young were quick to learn, and the fact that babies travelled on their mother's back meant that they saw exactly what she was doing at all times, an unexpected benefit of having grasping hands. Then the scientists changed the diet to unhusked rice. They wanted to keep the monkeys in one place so that they could observe them, and they reckoned it would take them a long time to pick out the rice from the sand. But they had reckoned without Emo. She grabbed handfuls of rice and sand together and threw the whole lot into the water. The sand sank, the rice floated, and she quickly skimmed it off. And once again, the habit spread. This ability, and indeed readiness, to copy and learn from your contemporaries and your elders results in the community having shared skills, shared knowledge, shared ways of doing things, having in fact a shared culture. The word, of course, is normally used for human societies, but there's no reason in principle why it shouldn't be applied to monkeys as well. And what this troop of monkeys have done is to develop a simple culture.
So hopefully everybody was able to sort of get the gist of that particular video. I bring this up even though this is a clip from 1979, because even in my like most recent versions of my animal behavior textbooks, when I'm teaching animal behavior, this example is included. It is an amazing, unique example of this kind of behavioral pattern being transferred from one generation to the next. So there's a couple of key points here that relate to our discussion about the evolution of religion. I'm not saying that these monkeys have religion, but I hope you can sort of go along with me that religion is part of culture. One, washing potatoes spread and was still happening 10 years after that initial monkey first started washing her potatoes. And then all monkeys were doing it, and that behavior pattern persisted. Only the very old monkeys didn't adopt the new customs, but the younger animals, especially those babies who were watching their mothers wash their potatoes, were the ones that also continued to pass on that particular behavioral characteristic. And then that comment that Attenborough made at the end, copying and learning from your contemporaries and elders, this idea of shared knowledge and skills and ways of doing things, this is this pattern of behaviors and passing them on is an aspect of shared culture. And so when we move on and start thinking about how exactly does culture evolve? Yes, absolutely, culture does vary. Yes, absolutely, culture is heritable. It can be passed on from generation to generation. And yes, culture offers differential reproduction. Those monkeys were able to especially the example at the end with the unhusked rice, they were able to enhance their ability to consume that unhusked rice by taking handfuls of it and dropping it in the sea. It makes it a lot easier than picking through the individual kernels of sand, even though that's what the scientists would have preferred, because then they could look at, different behavioral patterns a little bit easier. But that was an absolutely more efficient easier, better way to receive nourishment. So it absolutely conferred differential reproduction. And so because we're still talking about evolution, because we're still talking about natural selection, but we're no longer talking about physical characteristics and genes, I want to bring up this older book by Richard Dawkins called The Selfish Gene, in which he coined this term called meme, which sounds a lot like gene. So let's talk about that a little bit. A meme is to cultural evolution as a gene is to genetic evolution. So the way we think about genes propagating themselves in the gene pool via sperm and eggs, we can also think about memes propagating themselves in the meme pool by imitation. In other words, people copying a behavior, people copying a skill or a custom, and that's what enables it to propagate through the meme pool. So there's a difference here when we're talking about genetics versus memetics, but the overall broad overarching concepts are very similar and enable us to compare. So let's talk a little bit more about these memes. memes are heritable. They can be passed from generation to generation. Memes are units of information that can be passed from mind to mind. And when you're thinking about, what kinds of things might be passed, well, there are things like habits, there are things like skills, there are things like songs, and there are stories, and there are also other kinds of customs or ideas, giving you a preview there in images, which we're going to talk about in a little bit in the next section of this talk. So units of information that can be passed from mind to mind. Like genes, these units of information have variability. And so one of the things that I want to talk about is, for example, the way that the sort of modern laser was developed. This modern laser didn't just pop out fully formed, completely ready to go, hundreds of years ago. Modern lasers were built based on ideas varying, and the most fit ideas being passed from mind to mind and continuing to be refined and evolved. So I've got a very, very rough timeline here of different ideas evolving. We have John Dalton in 1803 that came up with atomic theory, basically that elements are made of atoms. And then in 1909, we have Ernest Rutherford that discovered protons, which was, really important to refining and, using in order to build on this idea towards creating like a modern laser. The very first laser was built by Theodore Maiman, who built something that's called a ruby laser, where a synthetic ruby crystal served as the gain medium. And then in 1960, he successfully demonstrated the operation of that first laser at the Hughes Research Lab in California. 10 years later, the laser was first used in more of a biologics kind of environment. Rangaswamy spent 30 years investigating the action of ultraviolet photons on organic molecules. And, he extended photochemistry of small organic molecules and made essentially the pulsed ultraviolet laser commercially available. And then we have in 1980 a woman named Patricia Bath, who was an American ophthalmologist and humanitarian who discovered and invented a new device co-opting this technology for cataract surgery known as laser phaco. So, this is, again, just a very, very rough kind of Cliff Notes version of one way in which that initial idea of atomic theory evolved over time to develop something that we have today called the laser phaco probe. So yes, ideas can be passed from mind to mind, and yes, ideas have variability where some of the more successful ideas are going to be the ones that are passed on to future generations. And then we also have these ideas that are in competition for survival. The example of the laser evolving over time was one of those examples where the more successful ideas were sort of co-opted to build the next iteration of that technology. I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn and convey some amusing memes that have varied in their ability to survive and be copied again into the next generation. When we think of memes now in modern day, we don't necessarily think about the way that Dawkins initially proposed it, in his Selfish Gene book. We think about it as those sort of funny pictures that get shared on social media or via text message. So for example, this is a meme from 2015. I think I saw it as recently as maybe 2018. 2021, I think I saw it. But so this is a meme that I really, really wanted of Pope Francis to go viral. It says, when threatened, the Pope can spray holy venom up to 25 feet. And it's kind of a comment on the wind picking up his hood and making him look like a snake, I guess. And I really, really wanted this one to survive. There was really only one reproduction of this where it gave what was happening here a name and called it the papal threat display. Popes are known to spit holy venom up to 30 feet, so it increased from 25 to 30. But unfortunately, this meme didn't really go anywhere. It kind of died off. It didn't really survive competition with other memes that were going around. I wouldn't be surprised if you hadn't seen this one. But there's another meme that has absolutely survived. This original statement from The Lord of the Rings, the very first Fellowship of the Ring, Sean Bean saying, "One does not simply walk into Mordor." If I were there with you, I would ask to see a show of hands, like how many people have seen this reproduction of this meme in a variety of different contexts. I'm sure a lot of you have seen at least one more of them. So, for example, here's one. One does not simply go to sleep, right? And there's another one. One does not simply begin to work without coffee. Here's another one. One does not simply drive home from McDonald's without eating any fries. And then here's the last one. Oh, no, there's one more. One does not simply walk into IKEA. And then the last one does not simply leave on time to drop off kids for the first day of school, right? So this one does not simply idea with Sean Bean saying very clearly one does not simply walk into Mordor it continues to be replicated. And these movies were made, I mean, the book has been around a long time, but this particular image were made in the early 2000s, I think. So a very, very, very successful meme. So what we've talked about in the first sort of 10 15 minutes of this talk is what characteristics are needed in order for an idea, a behavior, a skill to be passed on from generation to generation. And there is another meme, religion, that is made up of ideas, which is made up of behaviors and songs and ways of thinking, that is probably the most successful meme of history of humankind. And religion is made up of very different ideas, and religions are composed of, different songs and different prayers and different hymn books and different Bibles. But there are some universals. There are some things that all of these have in common. And that would be things like community, which gives rise to in-groups and out-groups. Religions can also give people meaning and purpose, and there are absolutely some consistencies and rules of conduct, rules of behavior that are consistent across different religions. So as a meme, as an idea that has been successful in propagating over time, religion is one of the most successful. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the psychological origins of religion. And again, I spend an entire semester talking about the psychology of religion. So I'm going to give you kind of the Cliff Notes version of 3 different potential psychological origins. As a dynamic and complex phenomenon, religion's origins have been examined from more than one domain. But as I said in the beginning, I'm going to focus on psychology. And as a reminder, psychology is the study of mind and behavior. It includes the study of conscious and unconscious phenomena, including feelings and thoughts. So let's first talk about the cognitive origins of religion. Cognition is primarily concerned with beliefs and how they are learned. For example, how are the ideological aspects of religion conceptualized? There are functional properties of our cognitive systems that facilitate a belief in the supernatural. Humans easily adopt the belief that souls and spirits exist in everything. If something happens that we can't explain, even now, there are lots of us where our first gut reaction is to posit an explanation that someone or something caused it. This is something called an agent detection device, and it was the root of some of the earliest forms of religions in early humankind. This is something that's also known as animism, where inanimate objects and ambiguous events are thought to be animated by sentient agents. So you might have heard of early humans referring to the sun god or the sea god or the sky god, things like that. The idea with animism is that non-human entities possess a spiritual essence. But this is, as I said, is not something that no longer exists in humankind. We very much still have this sort of tendency. Here's an example of a funny cartoon that sort of infuses souls and spirits into inanimate objects. We have a chocolate bunny who has had a bite taken out of it saying, "My butt hurts." And then another chocolate bunny who's had its ears bitten off saying, "What?" Right? And there are just countless, countless, countless examples. I had to actually stop myself from putting in more examples of these different kinds of cartoons because humans do tend to infuse these kinds of anthropomorphic characteristics into inanimate objects. We continue to do that all the time. One particular researcher who wanted to investigate these tendencies to infuse these sort of animate characteristics into inanimate objects. This researcher, Deborah Kellerman, conducted several studies around examining the sort of cognitive agent detection tendencies in children. And in this study that I'm highlighting here, this was not the first one, but she actually compares children in Britain and children in America, because both countries are industrialized, technologically advanced, literate, tend to be democratic nations, or at least they were at the time of this study, with a highly developed national media, compulsory education, and many comparable traditions, institutions, and social structures. So this was a really good populations to compare to one another. One of the major differences between the two countries is that God as a grand designer is a notion that has been more consistently endorsed in the United States than in any other modern industrialized nation. And in fact, it is an enduring, if not defining, feature of American culture. But Britain has no comparable kind of civil religion. So while America continues to maintain sort of a top ranking position on indices of religiosity, statistics from the most recent British Attitudes Survey conclude that Britain now has one of the least religious populations in the world. And so this, again, makes a good comparison between children raised in these two countries. So in this study, Deborah Kellerman was looking at 7, 8, and 10-year-olds, and they were shown pictures of living and non-living objects. And then they were asked a question about the object's characteristics. So for example, for a non-living object, she might show this picture of rocks and say, "Why is the rock so sharp and pointy?" And then she would they would select from options. One option would be something that focused on the more physical or more reductionistic explanation of, why the rock was so sharp and pointy. Reductionistic is an explanation of more complex life science phenomena in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry and biology, things like natural selection, evolution, and the way in which, for example, air and wind may have shaped things. But the other option, the other answer that they could choose from was more teleological, which can be either social or self-serving. Teleological explanations were philosophical arguments that nature has a goal, that it has a goal state analogous to purposes found in human actions. So an example answer to why is the rock so sharp and pointy, if it's a physical explanation, it could be that years of wind and water changed its shape. But another option that they had to choose from, that teleological, was that so animals won't sit on it. So the rock is sharp and pointy so that animals won't sit on it. So you can see that there's like a goal state, there's like a desire, like a want of the rock. And that's why it has these characteristics, okay? So the children were given, lots of these different kinds of scenarios, lots of different questions, and then given options to choose from. And overwhelmingly, the vast majority of kids, whether they were British or American, chose the teleological answer, the teleological explanation to the questions that they were posed, anywhere from 67 to 81%, depending on the specific study. Okay, but Deborah Kellerman did several follow-up studies because, people were critical of these results. Like, well, these are just children, right? Children that don't have, developed critical thinking skills and developed reasoning skills. If this study were done in adults or different populations, then you would get different results. And so, Kellerman said, okay, great, let's test out that theory. I'd love to know. And so she redid this study. She conducted this study again on Boston University undergraduates. Boston University is where she was doing this work. She asked true or false questions of these undergraduates, and things like the sun radiates heat because warmth nurtures life. Okay, the true or false options were given, and the answers to the explanations for a natural phenomenon tended, some of them tended to be more teleological, like this one, rather than reductionistic. And again, overwhelmingly, the undergraduates chose those teleological explanations. So these are adults. These are individuals that have presumably gone through at least some initial biology and science education and are now in their undergraduate in a 4-year university. They continued to answer very similarly as the children in the previous study. So then the critique was, okay, well, these aren't experts in science, right? These are, undergraduates, they may not necessarily have the refined critical thinking skills and underlying science knowledge that experts in their fields would have. So I'm sure the more educated a person is, the less likely they are to answer yes to these teleological kinds of explanations. And Kellerman said, okay, great, let's check that out. Let's figure out if that's actually true. So this study she conducted with physical scientists that were like world renowned in their field. We're talking, chemistry, physics, biology, like, physical scientists that have been working in their field for, decades and presumably have enhanced critical thinking skills and a very thorough understanding of underlying, physical characteristics. She did add one difference to this study that she didn't have add to the study with the children. She wanted the physical scientists to answer quickly. They had to, not really think about it, just read it and say yes or no or true or false. The scientists were given things like, germs mutate in order to become drug resistant. So again, this is another sort of teleological explanation that was given amongst a variety of different statements. The physical scientists were asked to, not take a ton of time to deliberate, answer very quickly. And again, even the physical scientists that explicitly reject teleological explanations for natural phenomenon were more likely to answer true to these kinds of statements when asked to answer in a hurry. So physical scientists' tendency to do this did not differ from humanities scholars, suggesting that scientific specializations do not in itself ameliorate scientifically and purpose-based theories about the natural world. This sort of default tendency of ours is very deeply ingrained, and having more education certainly helps, but it doesn't reset the default. It doesn't reset our sort of innate tendency to infuse animism into things that don't necessarily have animism. So I have there that our default is to presume events, objects exist for either self or socially serving purposes. And this is something that can be shown across all age groups, across all education levels, across lots of different defining characteristics. And so when we think about humans and, the idea that they may have something that's called a theory of mind, evolutionarily, this is actually a good thing that we have this tendency to adopt teleological explanations for things. That doesn't mean that we want everybody to think that there is a social or self-serving purpose to even inanimate objects, but in order for our earliest ancestors to survive, they had to be cautious and wary of the things that were occurring in their environment. There is this amazing article that's called "Bad is Stronger Than Good." And I have a quote from the paper here that says, talking about, evolutionarily, like early humans, the individual remains alive after several years only if he or she managed to survive every single day. And no degree of optimal experience on any given day can offset the effects of failing to survive on another. In other words, life has to win every single day, but death only has to win once, right? And that's a super powerful evolutionary motivator when we're not sure about something that's happening in our environment. It's a lot more evolutionarily stable for us to hear a bump in the night and think that it's someone or something than just some inanimate thing that we don't have to be worried about. Because the person who says it's nothing, it's just an inanimate thing, we don't have to worry about it, they may be right, but they only have to be wrong once to completely lose their lives. So the person who's a bit more cautious may have more superstitious behavior, might be a little bit more on guard, but also may be more likely to survive. Okay, so this idea of theory of mind then builds on this bad is stronger than good idea. Theory of mind is the ability to understand the mental states of others. So I'm pairing together here this idea that we sort of infuse anthropomorphic sort of animate qualities into inanimate objects, and also this ability for us to understand the mental states of others. Elizabeth Kulata wrote this article where she was pairing theory of mind with what we think about the entities that help us explain the natural events happening in our environment that we don't quite understand. She says, if you suspect that an agent was responsible for some mysterious event, it's a short step to thinking that that agent has a mind like your own. So if we're going to infuse tendencies into inanimate things in our environment, it's not hard to imagine that the tendencies we would infuse would be very much like our own. And even Darwin agreed with this idea. He wrote in The Descent of Man, humans would naturally attribute to spirits the same passions, the same love of vengeance or simplest form of justice, and the same affectations which they themselves feel. So it starts to become a little bit more clear. This is the end of kind of the cognitive origin before I take it on to the next step. But it starts to become clear that there are aspects of our cognitive system that are sort of built to support this idea that someone or something is out there guiding or shaping or influencing our lives. And that if we do that, we will infuse characteristics into that something or someone that is similar to ourselves. Okay, so I'm going to put a pin in that one. And then the next thing I want to talk about is more of the social origins of religion. Social psychology is primarily concerned with social interactions and their effects on others. And so I've got a few citations down there at the bottom. Hopefully people can sort of see the screen, and I've got the number there for which citation I'm kind of drawing from, but I'm not going to elaborate too much on the first two of these points. I will elaborate more on the third just for the sake of time. But there is evidence that religion promotes formation of stable groups. So it promotes cooperation among strangers, the formation of stable groups, and it starts to set up that sort of in-group, out-group idea. What makes us, better than those weirdos over the hill? We don't boil a calf in its own mother's milk. That's gross, or something along, those ideas. You start to bond over similarities of ideas, of practices, of behaviors that help guard against or insulate against the differing ideas of other neighboring groups in your area. Religion may also boost survival and reproductive fitness. So humans have pretty much always lived in groups. Not all animals do this. Some animals are solitary and only come together during mating season. But humans are among the different animal species that tend to survive better when living in groups. And so what is one way that you can sort of enhance group cohesiveness? Well, religion may be one way to enhance that group cohesiveness, which would then enable us to boost our survival, produce more offspring, make more of those offspring survive to adulthood so they can have their own offspring. There's this really amazing book that talks about how religion is a great way to stabilize and kind of amalgamate or coalesce really big groups of people that will never ever meet each other because they're, the geographic area is so large. Like think about the United States, it's gigantic. And so there are ways in which we sort of cooperate with neighbors that we have never met through this sort of shared ideology of religion. So again, I'm just doing very cliff note sort of bulleted ideas here. Happy to talk more about that a little bit later. But here's the study. Here's the idea that I want to spend a little bit more time on. Humans behave better if they think they are being watched. Religion encourages helpful behavior to others, but if stability and reciprocity become insufficient, then research shows humans behave better if they think they're being watched. And there was this beautiful study called the Princess Alice study that is not only great in terms of the results, but sort of hilarious in how the study was done. This is an image from this paper, this Princess Alice study paper. Children needed to stand behind this white line. Hopefully you can see my mouse moving on the screen. And they had in this bucket, I guess this little boy is holding on to the sticky balls. They're like Velcro balls. They had to throw the ball so that it would hit this target. Now that sounds simple just the way it is, but to add some extra challenge to this task, they actually had the children turn around and chuck the ball over their shoulder behind them. So this is going to be a really challenging task. But the idea is not to help students hit the bullseye or hit the target, because these children were divided into 3 different groups. The first group had absolutely no supervision. There was no one in the room. They were given, 5 or 6 or 7 of these little Velcro balls and had to toss it over their shoulder, but there was no one in the room to police them, to sort of manage them. The second group had an actual adult present in the room that would, sit in that chair that the boy is sort of looking at. They wouldn't say anything. They weren't actually manipulating or interacting, but they were just simply present in the chair. And then the third group was the invisible agent group, or the Princess Alice group. Those children were told there is, an invisible Princess Alice who is sitting there in the chair watching you. She won't say anything, she won't do anything, but she's in the room with you. And so what that little boy is doing is essentially like checking the chair, like, is she sitting there? And what these scientists were trying to measure is something called full cheating. Now, full cheating isn't just like turning around and throwing it, facing the target. Full cheating wasn't like stepping over the white line and maybe chucking it at the target. Full cheating was turning around and walking directly up to the target and sticking it directly on the target. That was full cheating. And so what the scientists were measuring in these different groups and in these different ages, there were 3 groups of 5 to 6-year-olds, and then there were the 3 groups of 8 to 9-year-olds. What they were measuring was simply how long did it take them to fully cheat. They knew that they were going to, but how long did it take them in each of these 3 groups? So in that adult supervision group, it took, it was the same between the 2 ages, but about, 150 seconds or so. So that's pretty quick. That's less than 3 minutes. That's about 2.5 minutes that it took for both of the age groups to just fully cheat with that adult just right there in the room. And then when there was no supervision, you can see that the time that it took to fully cheat was statistically significantly less. We can tell that it's statistically significant because we're looking at these error bars here. And if they overlap, then they're not statistically significantly different. If they don't overlap, then we can assume that there is a statistically significant difference there. Okay, so when there was no supervision in the room, those children cheated statistically significantly faster than when there was an adult physically sitting in the room. So what about the invisible agent? What about the Princess Alice group? Well, for them, they took the longest to cheat, the full cheating latency, the amount of time that it took to cheat was not statistically significantly different than if an actual adult was sitting in the room. Okay, that's sort of phenomenal, right? Because the children that didn't have anybody sitting in the room cheated much quicker, but the children who also didn't have anybody sitting in the room but were told somebody was sitting in the room behaved identically to when there was an actual adult in the room. So this idea of us behaving better, and in this case that was operationalized by full cheating, this idea of us behaving better when we think we're being watched was absolutely supported. Okay, so there are some social origins here to why we may have a predisposition to believing in religion or practicing these religious ideas. Now, the last origin of religion that I want to talk about is a bit of a preview of what I'm going to talk about in the next talk that I give. I think that's going to be in May. There are some neurotheology origins of religion as well. Behavioral neuroscience studies the interplay between the brain, behavior, and the environment. And there are 2 different parts of the brain that are really important here in understanding what's happening. Oh, and I'm running out of time too, aren't I? How much time? I can sort of skip this bit because I'm going to be talking a lot more about it in May. So I'm going to go ahead and just very briefly just talk about the fact that there's an area of the brain called the angular gyrus that I'll talk more about in May. When this particular area is disrupted, we tend to be unable to differentiate the space that our body occupies from our non-body space, which is what sort of gives rise to those very classic out-of-body experiences like feeling peace, feeling like you're floating, feeling like you're connected to everything around you. But I'll talk more about that in the talk in May. One thing that I want to do really briefly is this idea of like, okay, so if we have all these default mechanisms that lead toward religious behavior, why are there then atheists? And there are essentially 3 main theories to why there might be atheists. The idea of cultural scaffolding, that if our default is to have some kind of religious belief system, but there are aspects of our environment that might scaffold more secular thinking, things like literacy, things like higher education. There is another idea that there could be some survival benefits to being atheist, that the atheism is a selected strategy in some environments as long as they aren't too numerous. That's what that frequency dependence explanation is. And then the third one is just that there's cognitive variation. We said that in order for ideas to evolve, there needs to be variability. If all of the behavioral characteristics are religious, then there really isn't any non-religious behavioral variation. So there could be variability that in cognitive attributes that may lead to non-belief. There are some folks that think that atheists have different cognitive and personality characteristics than non-atheists would. I'm going to go ahead and skip through kind of how these different religions have changed. I think a lot of folks are familiar with the idea, and this isn't even the starting point. Like, I'm choosing Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Like, these are not the oldest religions. These religions all arose from other religions. So I'm sort of choosing them mostly because they are the most well known. But we can talk about how Christianity evolved from maybe 1 to 34,000 different versions of Christianity. We can certainly talk about how being and expressing sort of Jewish customs and Jewish characteristics has evolved over time. For example, there are now daily prayers rather than daily sacrifices. And we can also talk about how the Quran was divided into Meccan and Medinan verses, some that describe Islam's beginning and others that were more political and societal in structure once the environment around practicing Islam began to change. I also had some data about that from the Public Religion Research Institute. They updated their survey in 2023 to talk about the percentage of different religions in the United States. And some of the main findings here were essentially that white Christians are declining. As of 2023, there's only 38% of the American population identify as a white Christian, that people of all ages are becoming more religiously unaffiliated. And yes, it's true that the youngest 18 to 29-year-olds are the largest group. But in this most recent survey, they found that the 30 to 49 age group showed the largest increase from 2013 to 2023. And that also that Democrats tend to be more religiously diverse, while Republicans tend to be a little bit more white and Christian. I have a couple of older pieces of data, but I'm going to go ahead and skip to the overall conclusions just for the sake of time, but I'm happy to answer any of those additional questions. My overall conclusions essentially are that religious ideas and behaviors conferred an evolutionary advantage, and so they were passed on from generation to generation. Psychological traits of humans increase the probability of religious belief. Atheists are an emerging population brought forth through cultural scaffolding, adaptation, and perhaps personality characteristics, but that religion is not done evolving. The structure of religion adapts to the general trend of its believers. And there's this TED Talk that has nothing to do with religion that I show in my perception class, but it has this beautiful quote that I want to leave you with before we enter the question and answer portion. Bo Lotto is talking about light. He's talking about light in our environment and how we interpret light. And this idea that when we see color, it's purely what our brains are interpreting those photons and wavelengths as. There's no inherent color information in light. And so what he says, I feel, is a nice analogy to religion. He says the light that falls onto your eye, sensory information, is meaningless because it could mean literally anything. What's true for sensory information is true for information in general. There's no inherent meaning in information. It's what we do with that information that matters. And so I feel like that's a nice analogy to religion. Information is neutral. The idea that there is a higher power guiding the lives of humans in and of itself is no more dangerous than red, yellow, and green stoplights. It's what we do with that information that can sometimes be problematic. Passing laws to restrict reproduction rights or prevent marriage equality, driving planes into buildings, launching a worldwide crusade to convert individuals to your own beliefs and killing anyone who doesn't. those are human interpretations of what that information is. But there are lots and lots of other examples of people who don't do that. So the idea is simply that the information is neutral, and it's what we do with that information that matters. So sorry about that rushed conclusion. But that's kind of my introduction here about evolution of religion. As we have discussed, I'll be giving part 2, neurobiology of religious experiences, in May, and then neurobiology of morality in June or July. Thank you very much for listening, and my apologies for going over.
Dr. Strand, this was just amazing. It was just amazing.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Dr. Strand, for an excellent presentation. The perfect presentation that I needed before heading to Florida tomorrow. So my question is, obviously for our audience, we find it very entertaining, very statistically based or knowledge based, but how often do you get to give this presentation to a deeply religious audience, and what's their reaction?
I am very rarely asked to give this presentation to a deeply religious audience. I would say the closest analogy that I have is giving it to or having my family members attend. I think it took some time, but I think that if over time, kind of being the person that I am and trying my best to have open, honest conversations, I think that, I mean, and I don't, my goal was to never change anybody's beliefs, you know, believe what you believe, because that information is neutral. But please don't think horribly of me if I don't also think the same as you. I think that kind of eventually, I don't know if wore them down is exactly what I mean, but we came to a place of mutual agreement. So that's the closest analogy I have. I would love to give this talk to more religious groups because I don't think there's anything inherently offensive in this. I'm not trying to convince anybody to think differently than what they think, unless they're trying to pass laws that restrict other people from doing what they would like, if that
I
makes
agree
sense.
with that. I'll represent you in the South, try and get you book places.
Okay, sounds good. I'd love that.
Okay, let's get some questions from the friendly house. Questioner number 1, please come in.
Yes, good.
Great. All right, so no, it's a fascinating topic for me, so I really was excited to be here today. And I'll expose my nerdiness a little bit, but first off, are you willing to share your slides?
I could share PDFs of them, sure, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be awesome if
Yeah.
you email them to us.
Yeah, get your question, Dave. Is that your
Okay.
question?
That was just that was the
Okay.
Yes,
Quick.
but you got it. So I wonder if you could comment on, and you could save this for another talk if that's appropriate. But a recent book that came out was looking at technology as the enthusiasm and sort of trust in the future of technology as almost a correlate to religion. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I feel like folks tend to be really quick to label something as the next religion. You know, people are real quick to say that, you know, science is just another form of religion. I think what's really important to keep in mind, and what I convey to my students in my Psych of Religion class, is that religion has been around in almost every human society for 3 specific reasons that I alluded to in the beginning. One, it builds a sense of community, right? I'm not sure if, well, I mean, there's a community of science, I suppose, but it's not necessarily the same as the type of community that religion can build. And I guess it depends on the type of technology. If we're talking about social media, sure, there's certainly community there. So maybe it hits that kind of first criteria. Second, religion tends to give people purpose, life purpose, when they're feeling lost. I mean, this is a reason why things like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, they tend to encourage folks to sort of put their recovery, their trajectory towards, you know, more balanced, healthy living in the hands of a higher power. Religion has that capability. I'm not necessarily sure if other religious analogs that folks try to label as religion do. And then the third thing that none of those things absolutely does is that religion does give us answers to that sort of broader question of why we're here and why the earth is here, why humans exist. And that's not something that other forms of activities, whether you're talking technology or whether you're talking science or whether you're talking, your local bowling club or something like that, which also gives community and can give some purpose. That's something that's unique, that if you are not a believer, if you are more secular minded, you find in other ways, right? It's not that non-believers don't have or want answers to those questions. It's that you find them in other ways. So I get where the comparison is coming from, and I think it might satisfy, one or two of those kind of necessary psychological criteria, but I don't think it meets them all. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Well questioned too, Dave. Thank you so much for that. We have a questioner, number 2.
Yeah, it's me. I've identified 3 things or 4 things that are I think maybe both genetically and culturally transmitted. I wonder if you've identified them as falling into this group, and if you have any thoughts on any of them. Addictions to gambling, alcohol, drugs, and war. I think war is the most successful meme, and what in the world is going on there?
So can you kind of rephrase what is it that you're asking? You're saying that it falls into ideas that are culturally transmitted?
Culturally and perhaps both and genetically connected in terms of their success. But I can't understand why the vices persist when they're self-destructive, or you have a balance of destruction of the opposers of the meme and the destructions of those who perpetrate it. So what's going on there? Is that in balance, or
Yeah.
what?
That's not a small question. Here's the best that here's the best that I can do. What we know about addiction is that there absolutely is a physiological component. I think that there's some evidence that there is a genetic component, but I don't know how strong that evidence is. But there is absolutely a physiological component, which makes it challenging to just sort of snap your fingers and get over. So I would absolutely go with you on this idea that that things like addiction, alcoholism, and drug addiction could be something that might propagate itself through behavioral patterns. But I think it has more to do with what's happening physiologically and receptor proliferation in certain brain regions. But the idea of war, I think it fits perfectly, and I think there's a great explanation for it, as horrible as that is. But I mean, think about why war, why conflict, if you even just bring it down, why conflict tends to happen. One, you're trying to make others believe what you believe. 2, there is nothing that binds a group of people together than having a common enemy. So why not prolong that by, actually propagating physical harm on their bodies and on their geography? It's a great way to make sure that your ideas increase in frequency in the meme pool, but it's also a great way to stabilize and bring, groups of people together that might not normally otherwise. That's a very cut and dry, just sort of horrific explanation, but I think it definitely fits within what we're talking about today.
Hey, tons of great food for thought in multifaceted ways. I might have missed one thing that I want to ask in case I missed it. When you were comparing the British kids and the American kids and the frequency of teleological, spirit world kind of explanation versus maybe raw physics, did you mention whether the Americans ended up being significantly different than the British, or did we all drift towards teleological explanations equally?
That is a great question. I didn't explicitly say that. All I said was that children tended to choose teleological explanations, and there was no difference between the American and the British children. They tended to all choose those teleological explanations. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. I should have mentioned that.
A sort of liberal religious belief that's kind of like metaphorical, like, you know, God is love, God is nature, God is beauty, God is truth. That's not animist and can't really, I don't think, be explained by that kind of early explanation of religion they give, where we just tend to see like purpose and personhood in inanimate things. And so, and people who say stuff like God is love might identify as Christian, but it's pretty far from anything that you could like really ground in a biblical text. So I just wonder where these ideas, like, you know, sort of the distinction between spirituality and religion, these kind of metaphorical definitions of God, fit in the evolution of religion.
Absolutely, a great question. Also not a question that's can be answered quickly and concisely. Here's what I can tell you. The biggest difference between religion and spirituality is that religion tends to describe institutions and physical locations. Like if you are going to a place to sit in a pew or sit in a place and sing the songs from the books and say the words in the books and, you know, that kind of thing. Spirituality is everything else that can't be immediately observed. Spirituality is going to be things that deal more with your internal kind of beliefs, your internal, not necessarily outwardly observable behaviors, but you know, how do you feel about? Gosh, I'm trying to think of one of the surveys that we talk about in class. And I'm blanking, but basically like religion is kind of the physical institution and the outwardly observable like church attendance. Spirituality is going to be kind of everything else that isn't so immediately observable. When I hear people saying God is love, God is friendship, God is trust, you know, making those kinds of vague associations, to me, that sounds like somebody who wants to have a broader let's all just get along, let's all be friends, why do we have to fight so much, without necessarily saying I'm a humanist, I'm an agnostic, I'm an atheist. Because I think atheism in particular has a strong negative connotation, and it can be really challenging to outwardly admit that, even if you're, or even inwardly sort of acknowledge that in yourself. And so when I see somebody saying those kinds of things, my interpretation of that is they're moving away, they're on the fence. They might not necessarily feel the affinity or the resonance of organized religion, and maybe they're starting to embrace more spiritual, more secular kinds of ideas, behaviors, things like that, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Dr. Strand. It crosses my mind that many of us here at the humanist meetings come from religious communities, but that we have chosen to leave. I've been a member here at the Human for well over 20 years, and we're not real popular at funerals. When someone, you know, they're in a better place, it sounds like you're dealt with that with your own family. Can you give us some advice on how not to be those sharp? And we're very well behaved, actually. We do.
Okay. Oh, I get it. Yeah, no, I get it. Because people want to
deal with that kind of ideal.
So I have unfortunately experienced a lot of death in my family in I would say the last 10 years or so, and it's been really rough. And you know, it's rough on a few different dimensions. One, most of my family are believers. I am not. But also, like, how do you? So I will say that the thing that I say that tends to smooth, or at least at the very least not draw attention, because that's the last thing that you want. You don't want to amplify someone's pain by shoving your ideals down their throats. What I say is, I think where the common ground is the best way to honor someone is to talk about how they touched your life and how they mutually, shared stories, shared memories, how you're going to carry the memories of that person with you through your life, and how you're going to sort of keep them alive in your heart. I think that's something that every single person, regardless of beliefs, wants to do in order to kind of manage that grief. The part where I start to personally check out is when folks start to talk about how they're going to meet people who have passed previously. I mean, I'm not vocal about, disagreeing with that idea, but I also think that idea is neutral. Like that doesn't harm anyone. If that's what folks need in order to process their grief, I am not going to stand in the way of that. That's not how I process my grief. I do that differently, if that makes sense.
And it is, he will live on in my heart is such a nice comment, because they will. They will. Yep. My mom has been gone many years. My dad has been gone over 50, but he still lives on in my heart.
Absolutely.
Yes. It seemed that you indicated that the studies you cited show that most people confuse correlation with causation. Even scientists do if you ask them to respond quickly. So it seems that you're indicating that we're inclined to sense events as caused. And then the question becomes, caused by what? Things that are natural or things that are supernatural? What brings in the supernatural part?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's the correlation versus causation aspect. The specific statements that were given as examples, can I put them in the chat? Is that okay if I put them in the chat?
Sure can.
The ones I observed were all becauses.
Which are true in teleological explanations as well.
Those are the ones that are implying that correlation is causation.
So here's the teleological explanation for the pointy rocks versus the, I'm sorry, that was the physical explanation. It's going to take me a second to stick it in here. The physical explanation was because years of wind and water changed its shape. So that is a because statement, but it focuses more on the actual physical characteristics of the environment, versus in that first example, the teleological explanation was so that animals won't sit on it. So both of them have becauses, both of them have explanations. And we're not asking, in this case, the children to identify the specific ways in which wind and water might wear stones down. The essential difference between those two statements is that one focuses on the natural phenomena, the environmental characteristics of years and years and years of environmental shaping, versus the other one assumes that the rock has a want, that the rock has a need. But then when we move into the undergraduate example, I only showed teleological. So the first one, these were both teleological. So this first one was the sun radiates heat because warmth nurtures life. And then the second one was germs mutate in order to become more drug resistant. So both of those, again, just like so animals won't sit on it, both of those teleological explanations are focusing more on a socially serving or a self-serving reason. It's a socially serving reason that the sun radiates heat because warmth nurtures life. That's not why the sun radiates heat. The sun radiates heat for physical and chemistry reasons.
Even though it does.
Exactly. But that's not why it does.
There's the correlation.
So a teleological, a physical explanation might be something like, a plant uses energy from the sun in order to grow, like, using photosynthesis, right? Like that's more of a physical explanation. So it's the sun developing, evolving properties to utilize what's present in the environment, as opposed to the sun doing that so that the flower can grow, right? So that's a social serving purpose that's written in more of a teleological explanation. It's not quite cause and correlation versus causation. It's like, what is the reason for this thing to be? And like germs mutate in order to become drug resistant. That's not the idea that they have in their little brains, right? That's not why they're doing it. There's variability in the population. Some of those variations are going to be more successful than others. And so the ones that have that variability survive, and the ones that don't die. And so it's not that the ones that are dying are like, oh, I wish that I had, it's like, it's only because those ones that have the characteristic are increasing in frequency. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you for your
Sure.
response to my question and your presentation. Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
I'm going to like one more question because you're just fascinating. And so from Richard wants to know, Richard, can you come in real quick and ask a quick question about spiritualism versus thinking?
Yes, I think it was Bertrand Russell who said that that spiritualism is a wonderful way of feeling, but it's not a good way of thinking. And it made me think about,
Richard, you got to ask a question.
yes, is the difference between atheists and religious people that atheists actually get much more pleasure out of thinking than religious people do. Religious people get much more, a much bigger feeling.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't think there's one difference between believers and non-believers. I think that one of the explanations that I gave for atheism that I had to kind of skim right over is this idea that there are certain cognitive traits that atheists, or people who become atheists, might have, that people who aren't atheists might not have. And I do think that relying more on data and relying more on what one can see and feel and hear and touch, that kind of thing means more. But even amongst non-believers, there are aspects of things that we don't have evidence for, that we do sort of have to base on faith, for lack of a better reason. So I think the answer to your question is yes and no. I think that there are some characteristics that atheists have or non-believers have that believers don't have, but I also think that there's some fuzzy lines there, because life is long, life is hard. People gain satisfaction and happiness and fulfillment in different ways, and the believer versus non-believer divide, I don't think it's as divided as we like to think it is. I don't know. That's a very quick answer to that question.
Dr. Strand, thank you so much.
Of course.
I'm really thrilled you're coming back.
Me too. Me too. Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure.